what I'm calling predatory capitalism. You must have come across this term by now. And the idea is to distinguish, because after all, welfare state was also a kind of capitalism, right? So predatory capitalism is one in which the entire pretense or the need to take the masses with you is over. Under welfare capitalism, under social welfare states, it was state capitalism, but the idea was that you build the market by distributing some of the profits. But now there is no such idea at all. So I'm using the term predatory capitalism, and it is used to reflect a particular stage that capitalism has now reached. But there's certain elements of it, I'll talk about that. Now, what happens here is that, so let me begin by saying, and this is kind of continuing from the lecture I gave earlier, not that you have to have attended it, but we have to recognize that the invocation of secularism enables an uncritical acceptance of the violence of capitalism on people and nature as the historically inescapable way into modernity. What I mean by this is that there's a way in which the discourse of secularism sees religious sectarianism. Can I not have this fan on, please? So what happens is that secularism presents itself as opposing religious sectarianism, and what that means is that nature is desacralized. Nature is no longer seen as something that is part of what human beings are. This happens with the coming of modernity. We're talking of a long process. And nature is evacuated of those properties, and nature becomes something that is a pure commodity. So if you think of the term natural resource, nature is supposed to be something that is not connected to human beings, and you can use it, and this is something that you see across the board with modernity. This is not particularly right-wing at all. So what happens is that land, forests, rivers are all disenchanted, and they are available to be commoditized. And it is seen as the beginning of the journey from the darkness of pagan beliefs and religious sectarianism into the light of modernity. Thus, the project of secular modernity emerged alongside capitalist transformation in the West, and in post-independence India too, is intimately tied to a notion of development which is predicated on the large-scale sacrifice of the interests of specific communities in order to serve the greater interest of the Indian citizen. So there's the dispossession of communities from resources and land, but there's another related factor, and that is environment or ecology. Since much of the resistance to capitalist transformation is conducted today by indigenous peoples across the globe, whether it is the oil pipeline in North America, in the US, where indigenous people say this is the land of our ancestors' graves. You see, they're not using secular language, they're using spiritual language. Or the Niyamgiri Hills. When the tribals protest and won the battle against Vedanta, they use very spiritual language. So what happens is that much of the resistance to capitalist transformation is conducted by indigenous peoples whose lands are rich in minerals, and the resistance is often conducted in terms that sacralize nature and draw on indigenous spiritualities. Secular environmentalism is often unable to relate to this mode of resistance because we don't know how to engage with that language of spirituality. On the other hand, in India, the political doctrine of Hindutva has a dual relationship to capitalism. When capitalist development counters Brahminical Hinduism, then Hindutva stands opposed to it. So if any of you has been following this long-standing controversy over something called the Setu Samudram project, which is the idea is to dredge the canal, dredge the Park Straits, so that ships can directly go through rather than going around Sri Lanka. And the whole debate has been that what you see there is so one argument is that is the bridge built by Ram to go to Sri Lanka. The other argument is, so it's man-made. This is the argument that BJP has been using. It's man-made, it's not a myth. It was made by Ram and his army to cross to Sri Lanka. And the ecologists are saying it's not man-made, it's natural, it's a coral reef. And interestingly, in the beginning, at the beginning of this debate, when this project started, environmentalists, who we all respect, I mean, people like Praful Bid, right, initially began by countering Hindutva by saying it's not man-made, it can be destroyed. We should destroy it, we should build. So, because we have an automatic way of responding to Hindu right-wing kind of claims. Later, an environmentalist position emerged which said that it should not be destroyed because it has huge ecological significance. It has huge significance for fisher people who live in that region. Sri Lankan fisher people joined in the movement. So there's a big environmentalist kind of argument against that project. But the only voice you hear in court is the voice of Hindutva, saying this is, so then the court is discussing, does faith matter, does development matter, development is shipping. So you see the environmentalist position is not even being discussed. So either Hindutva wins and the Setu Samudram project will not take place, or Hindutva loses and the Setu Samudram project will take place. But in fact, it is something which as environmentalists, all of us should be resisting, and there is now that strong voice. Now, what I'm trying to say is that when it is a Brahminical Brahminical religion, when it is about the Ramayana, then the BJP stands opposed to it. But when you think of and I'll talk about that, there are indigenous peoples are being removed from their land, etc. When that happens, so if you've been following Pathalgadi, for example, the Pathalgadi movement across the tribal belt of India, we can talk about that later if you like, but there it's the BJP government that is not caring about any kind of spiritual resistance to these lands, and the idea is to just control it for capitalist development, to hand over to crony capitalism. So Hindutva has, I'm saying, it has a dual relationship to capitalism. When capitalist development counters Brahminical Hinduism, Hindutva stands opposed to it. But the Hindutva-driven state supports capitalism against indigenous and other spiritualities. Of course, we should remember that the support for capitalism comes from perfectly non-Hindutva, non-majoritarian states as well, states as in governments. So we must remember that the widespread continuation of what is called pre-capitalist forms of production, both in agriculture and non-agricultural sectors, is what confronts capital's onward march. These are, to use the term I'm not comfortable with using the term pre-capitalist because that suggests a teleology, right? It suggests a certain direction. Everything is heading in the direction of capitalism. It's a historically inevitable state. So I don't like to use the term pre-capitalist. What we should be talking about is that these are actually non-capitalist rather than pre-capitalist forms, and capitalism's attempts to seize, discipline, control them, subsume them within its own domain, but they constantly escape its logic. So the transformation to bourgeois private property therefore always involved a violent decimation of all forms of common property and even non-capitalist private property. If you have read Capital Volume 1, chapters 26 to 28, which are the chapters on primitive accumulation, if you haven't read it as a group study thing, you should. You will see how Marx talks about how capitalism comes into being in England and the violent role of the state in expropriating, dispossessing the peasantry in order to turn them into, it happens over a couple of centuries, to turn them into completely dispossessed proletariat, wage labor, right? So capitalism has always been violent. Capitalism all over the world has always been implemented by an extremely violent state, and if there is no violent state backing it, capitalism cannot succeed. Capitalism is not some kind of inevitable state which just comes. It has to be brought about by the violent intervention of the state. Now, let's look at, for example, so what I'm saying is that the transformation to bourgeois property has always involved a violent ending of all forms of common property. Now take the story of land acquisition legislation in contemporary India. In 2013, the Right to Fair Compensation and Transparency in Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act, LARA, L-A-R-R-A, was passed, replacing the 1894 Act. Now remember, in 2013, we are still talking of the UPA-2 regime. The UPA-2 regime was very much constrained by democratic pressures. Social movements were very much involved in the kinds of legislation that came out of UPA 1 and 2. By the time of UPA 2, it had become quite neoliberal. The second term of UPA 2 was quite neoliberal, but still in 2013, this particular act, which was replaced the 1894 Act, and the key provisions of this new legislation by 2013, so what happens is by 2013, UPA 2 is heading for neoliberalism, and the new legislation re-enshrined the state's power to dispossess land for private profit, but ensured prices for land and rehabilitation and resettlement. And this is so when you say give farmers a share of the profits, it's like you're giving them a one-time payment, and then there's no development. The state is not showing any interest in development. The state, I'm putting development in quotation marks really, but because farmers have their own, non-capitalist forms of property have their own logic. There's no need to transform everything into capitalist property. So this one-time payouts instead of a long-term responsibility, LARA thus represents the contradiction between the land requirements of a neoliberal capitalism and the pressures on the state on account of electoral democracy. So this factor, giving the farmers a one-time payout, comes out of the pressures of electoral democracy. More importantly, this policy concretizes a significant shift. So from 2013, you can see this shift. It had started happening in that decade, but in those 5 years. Now what is the shift that we see? That the state dispossesses people of their land not for public sector infrastructure, which is what used to happen earlier, which is equally problematic, because that public sector infrastructure was also a background for industrialists. But now the state, in effect, after this act, becomes a broker for private capital. The state is acquiring land cheaply and handing it over to private capital. So the state has become the dalal for private capital. Think about it. Why shouldn't the industrialists directly deal with the farmers? Why shouldn't the industrialists directly ask for, why shouldn't the farmers say, give us land, don't acquire land, pay us market prices, give us shares in your company? If you really want to take capitalism seriously, which I don't, but supposing there are farmers who want to, and they think capitalist development is fine, then because land prices keep escalating. You're selling, what is the state doing? It's short-circuiting this whole process. Taking land cheap, handing it over to corporations who are making massive profits, and these people are just dispossessed. But the 2013 law can also be seen as an advance on the 1894 law because it gave people a say in land acquisition and made the process participative. This was the pressure of democratic movements I was talking about. It promised to put an end to forcible acquisitions and enhance compensation to landowners to resettle and rehabilitate families displaced by land acquisition, and it gave the Gram Sabha decision-making powers in land acquisition. Now, so here is the UPA government trying to make capitalists happy, arriving at this law, but because it is still constrained by democratic pressures, it includes all these features which the industrialists are not at all happy about. So what happens is that, so if you remember, you're all very young, but still, the term that was used to attack the UPA 2 Manmohan Singh government was policy paralysis. That UPA 2 is somehow unable to deliver. Deliver what and to whom? To the capitalists. So, in fact, so what happens is that they were simply not neoliberal enough for the capitalists. So soon after, so what happens is this law is enacted in 2013, but soon after it was enacted, on 1st January 2014, the newly elected BJP government diluted many of its provisions through an ordinance by which the government could acquire land for any private entity without obtaining the consent of affected people, and did not have to do social impact assessments. So basically what happens is that the ordinance basically took away all rights of the people to control what would happen to their land. The ordinance lapsed, but several states have bypassed the law and implemented their own acts by replicating the ordinance, even as the amendment bill is still under consideration. So you can see this is a pattern that this government uses. You can't enact the UCC at the center, so all the states are going to enact. Does it even make sense? If you're going to call it a uniform civil code, can we have as many codes as there are states? And that will only be in BJP ruled states. Not to mention the horror of what that Uttarakhand so-called uniform code is. That's not the topic of the discussion today, but we can talk about it later if you like. My point is that this is how they do it. They did this, the conversion, they pass it in their states, and they just pass it. There's no discussion, they just pass it. So the ordinance has lapsed, but several states have implemented these laws. Alongside this big push towards, alongside this big push, we also see what looks like a very progressive measure, which is women's rights to land. So you see from 2005 onwards, women's rights to individual rights to land has been brought about by the previous government, and these UCCs also, the way in which the BJP talks of individual also, the individual rights to land are being of women, and you're using the banner of gender justice. Everything is using the banner of gender justice, right here. Whether it's UCC, whether it is triple talaq, it would seem that the BJP government and its forces are the greatest champions of women's liberty and women's autonomy and women's control over their bodies, the way they go on. So, rights to land. Now, we have to understand that this is something that a lot of, including, for example, IDWA, a lot of organizations of the left are recognizing that individual rights to land is a way of bypassing community rights in order to make land easily alienable and available for dispossession, available for acquisition. So community rights are being gradually replaced by individual rights. So for example, in March 2018, the Arunachal Pradesh Land Settlement and Records Amendment Act was passed, giving ownership rights to indigenous people of the state of Arunachal Pradesh. People had held land as a community, now it's giving individual rights to these people, to the indigenous people. And the state government said in a statement that with this legislation, huge investments are expected which will augment the economy of the state. Why will individual rights to land lead to huge investments? What does it mean? It means that it will be easier to acquire land from individuals. When it's a community ownership, then there is much more of a control and much more of a discussion as to what should be done and when to do it. Once you individualize it, individuals can be made to. So this is a move, it's not a fantasy that I'm making up. This is something that you see all over Latin America and Africa. And all over Latin America and Africa, left-wing movements are resisting the breakdown of community property in this way, because this is a way in which capitalist development is being pushed. All the evidence from India, Africa, and Latin America goes to show that the push for individual rights to land is a strategy that achieves nothing more than opening up land for capitalist transformation, often via the state. So it's essentially state-sponsored redistribution of land from the poor to the wealthy. That's what it is. Once upon a time, social redistribution meant taxation and transfer of wealth from the wealthy to the poor. Now, redistribution means transfer of wealth from the poor to the wealthy. So what I'm trying to say is that the neoliberal agenda is not necessarily linked to Hindu Rashtra, but it's a devastating impact when it is. So the impact of neoliberalism is worse when it is linked to the project of Hindu Rashtra. Because as you know, there's a kind of a deranged mythology that has been cooked up in the headquarters of the RSS of the urban Maoist jihadi network. And under this banner, so many of our brave journalists, intellectuals, students are still in jail. Why? So what is it? What is it about the urban Maoist jihadi network that gives them so much excitement? Because it blends the two enemies of Hindu Rashtra into one. The enemy of Hindu supremacism, who are all, according to them, jihadis. All of us are jihadis. If we oppose Hindu Rashtra, we are jihadis. If we oppose capitalism, we are urban Maoists. So the urban Maoist jihadi network is the fantasy of the RSS, but this fantasy, all these WhatsApp forwards are what turn up in police accounts now. When the police make a charge against journalists or students or intellectuals, it reads like a WhatsApp forward. That's the level of the investigation, because there's nothing to say. They have nothing to say. There's no such network, right? So it's important. So then what happens is that there's a coming together of predatory capitalism and Hindutva in this way. Now let's look at regular capitalism and the saffron agenda. The corporate loot behind the saffron banner has been going on since 2014 and has escalated since May 2019. That is the neoliberal restructuring of the economy and sale of the country's public assets to corporates. Now in Kashmir, within 75 days of the abrogation of Article 370, what happens in that period? 125 projects were cleared in 3 meetings, diverting forest land for so-called development projects, the details of which were not divulged to journalists. And the other thing that happens is, within a week of COVID-linked lockdown being declared, the government issued a Gazette notification changing the domicile rules for Jammu and Kashmir to redefine as resident anybody who has lived for 15 years in the former state or studied there for 7 years. What does this mean? So they can apply for jobs, they can own immovable property. Essentially, what is that doing? It is opening up Kashmir for settlement by non-Kashmiris. It's a demographic transformation. It is an Israel-type move. It is settler colonialism. That's what it is, okay? It's an old RSS dream. This decision fulfills the agenda of both Hindu supremacism and predatory capitalism, because land can now be bought by outsiders for any purpose, including commercial. So that's what happens. You can see it coming together. You can also see capitalism just working quite nicely, without necessarily targeting Muslims. But we'll come to that also. Since 2014, a one-time expansion of 25% given to coal mines into 2012 has been extended twice, without taking into account impact on environment, and now a new draft policy plans to make such expansions the norm. Anyone who studies Odisha knows, and there's been a lot of work on this in the state of Odisha, mining companies are supreme, with fraudulent permissions. All this is post-2014. So this is what I'm calling regular capitalism under the SAP. Fraudulent permissions from village committees being used to legitimize open loot of Adivasi resources and the destruction of their forests for mining. During the lockdown, while non-essential projects were on hold, and the Prime Minister demanded contributions from the public for the newly formed, opaque, unaccountable CARES Fund, one of the first acts of the Ministry of Housing was to issue a notification to continue with a 20,000 crore rupees project to develop the Central Vista around India Gate. Right? I mean, what used to be India Gate, so the demolition, the rebuilding, all of this was happening during the lockdown. The details of the transformation of this iconic and heritage area was shrouded in secrecy, and the contract was given to a private firm based in, no prizes for guessing which state, Gujarat. This project is nothing less than a massive capture of public land by super elites. In November 22, the Union Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change approved Stage 1 clearance for the diversion of 130.75 square kilometers of forest in Great Nicobar Island, which is nearly a quarter of all the forest land diverted in the past 3 years in the country. That's the level of diversion. The trees to be felled up, and which would now have been felled, are primary evergreen tropical forests. Indigenous tribes that inhabit these forests will be fatally displaced, have been fatally displaced. Hundreds of rare species of fauna and coral cover are to be destroyed. You remember the tamasha over Lakshadweep versus Maldives. So this is supposed to be a great thing, that Lakshadweep can now expect what Nicobar has got. This is a great present to Lakshadweep, that it will be destroyed the way Nicobar is being destroyed. In 2014, the waters of the Narmada Dam, remember how many hundreds of thousands of people, never forget, were displaced by the Narmada Dam. Hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced by the Narmada Dam, supposedly for development. You remember, if you look up even now, you will see images of them standing with water above their heads in a Jaral Satyagraha. Where were those waters diverted? What were they told? You're being selfish. And this is not only Hindu Rashtra. Narmada project is older than Hindu Rashtra. This is why I'm saying we should not be mistaken. We should not think that Hindu Rashtra and capitalism come together, and once Hindu Rashtra goes, the question of capitalism is settled. No, it's not settled. That's another battle. So these people gave up their lands and their livelihoods for what? They were told, you're selfish, you're not thinking of the non-irrigated parts of the country, etc. Waters of the Narmada Dam were directed to Coca-Cola's new bottling plant. For decades, farmers protesting against dispossession had been castigated for selfishly denying water for drinking and irrigation to others. Since 2014, I've talked about the coal mining. In the field of education, the National Education Policy of 2020 formalizes the ongoing process of making public universities self-financing, encouraging private capital in education, while simultaneously establishing government control over research and content of education in a manner compatible with the ideal of Hindu Rashtra. So you're going to have the worst, we are going to have the worst of capitalism and Hindu Rashtra. So privatization, you're paying through your noses, self-financing, but research agendas will be set by the government. Topics for research have been given to us. Those are all just coming our way. And and basically, they're all, the research topics are basically, this is the government policy and it's a great policy. That's the research question, that's the research topic, that's the end of the research. Now, and we know that the public sector is being rapidly dismantled and privatized. Now, how much can I take? How much longer can I take? Another 5, yeah, okay. So now I want to talk about something that I call Corona capitalism, which is a particular kinds of features that emerged during the pandemic. And there are two ends of it, as it were. The low end of Corona capitalism, low in the sense of poorest, is forced labor, and the high end is data capitalism. So let me explain this. So you remember, all of you would remember the gut-wrenching picture of migrant workers who managed to reach their home state of UP being sprayed with disinfectant. You remember that, what happened. And it provoked such widespread outrage and negative publicity in the foreign media that the health ministry issued a hasty statement that this should not be done. But this brutality and callousness towards workers and the poor emanates from the very top of this regime. The signal is sent from there as to who matters and who doesn't. For example, during the lockdown, even as thousands of workers walked long distances home because no transport was arranged for them, precisely in order to prevent them from leaving the states in which they were stranded, and I'll tell you why in a minute, the UP government organized buses to bring back students from the state studying outside. Then, apparently, the COVID virus did not travel with middle class people in buses. It only traveled with migrant workers walking. Special flights and hospital beds were prepared by the government to bring back Indians stranded abroad. Lakhs of migrant labor were trapped, as we know, in horrific conditions. There were rumors, there were fake news of buses being arranged, they would all land up. You remember, they would just land up in their thousands and buses wouldn't be there, special trains they said would be run, they would land up at railway stations, not find them, etc. And when they landed up like that, they were lathi charged. When they heard, सब याद रखा जाएगा, if you remember. We cannot forget. We have to bear witness to this. I know we all know, but we have to keep saying it. This is what they did to the workers of this country, right? They land up there in desperation. There's a kind of a situation in which they think there will be trains, there are no trains. They were lathi charged. So they were lathi charged in Mumbai, tear gassed in Surat. Some state governments, West Bengal, Kerala, Delhi, to my knowledge, that took on the responsibility of feeding these hundreds of thousands, but only in these states. But largely it was ordinary citizens, many of whom had been active in anti-CAA protests, who stepped up across the country. Some of you may have even been involved in it, financially and physically, to set up networks, including NGOs, to prevent mass deaths by starvation. The central government's contribution to this has been negligible. I'm not saying it. It had to reply to the Supreme Court and it gave the figures. And it was negligible. So the collateral damage of this tragic government-produced crisis was high, as we know. Now, we're wondering, what is it? Why do you want to keep the workers from moving? What is it? It's obviously not your fear of COVID spreading. It's something else. And the hint to what it is came from this very interesting order, that government order, April 19, dated April 19th, issued by the Ministry of Home Affairs. It's an extraordinary document. I saved it. Now I don't think you'll find it anywhere else. It was called a Standard Operating System for the Movement of Standard Labor, 2020, April 19, 2020. What did this standard operating system say? Now, I want to say right from the beginning that this was withdrawn. But the fact that they issued it gives us an idea of what they were doing. So what did it do, this government order? There was an outright prohibition on migrant labor, even those tested and found asymptomatic, from moving out of the state from where they were currently trapped and go back to their home state. So prohibition. To the recruitment of asymptomatic workers, and this is where we get the cue. This standard operating system said, so you're going to trap them in the states where they are. If they're asymptomatic, they will be recruited in industrial, manufacturing, construction, farming, and Manrega works, only in the state in which they are currently located, for which they must be registered with the local authority concerned. There is a word for this, forced labor. This is forced labor, this is begad, which happens in agriculture. This is forced labor. You're going to trap them, you're not going to allow them to leave, and they have to register. This is what happened in the 16th and 17th centuries in England, which Marx talks about. People who refused to work were punished. There were punishments for people refusing to work in the factories. They were either sent away to Australia as criminals, or they were actual specific. Please read chapters 26 to 28. You won't feel, oh, this is so strange. You'll feel, oh my God, is he talking about 21st century? That's exactly how capitalism works. So you're going to trap them. You have to. So after testing for COVID-19, the asymptomatic workers are not allowed to go. They have to remain within the states and to be transported to where the labor is needed. It seems clear in retrospect that the lockdown with only 4 hours of notice was not inefficiency, but deliberately intended to stop labor from leaving cities. There was an uproar, the order was not implemented, eventually we heard no more about it, but attempts by industry in collaboration with the government to force labor to stay where it was needed continued. And you will have read about IAS officers being suspended for organizing buses for labor to go. There were people from, I think, I can't remember the political organization, where two or three people who bought tickets for labor to get onto train, they were arrested. So what's going on here? So this is forced labor. This is one end of what happened under Corona capitalism. So that order was withdrawn. The order spelled it out. You know, it like really told you exactly what the idea was. But even though that order was withdrawn, the actual business of forcing them to stay continued. So that's one end, what I call the low end of Corona capitalism. The high end is data capitalism, because this is what has come to stay. Data capitalism is here to stay. India is one of the leading offerers of of space for data capitalism. Now, if you remember, there was something called the Arogya Setu app. Once again, so there was a huge pressure from the government at every level to download the Arogya Setu, which is a contact tracing mobile application launched by the Union Health Ministry, which was supposed to help. Everything has some very nice sounding reason, right? So it will help you identify if they're at risk from COVID-19 infection. So what happens with the Arogya Setu app? The ministry asks social media platforms to promote installation of the app among their users, giving these platforms a target of a minimum of downloads of millions. So you know how social media is controlled by the government here. Given that they hate China so much, they're learning a lot from China also. So, some departments of government made it mandatory for employees and some food delivery companies for their delivery partners to install the app. In short, Arogya Setu was aggressively promoted by government and private interests alike. Guess who was really happy about this and wrote a congratulatory letter to the Prime Minister, Bill Gates. Bill Gates congratulated him on this. His delight in an app that could collect data from potentially the entire mobile phone owning population of India is not so intriguing. In the US, the Gates Foundation, at least one attempt was spotted. Gates Foundation tried to collect massive amounts of unspecified data through their school test scores. And it was thwarted because parents resisted and school administrations resisted over privacy and security issues. So Gates Foundation tries to do this, they're like, "Kam nahi kar paye, tumne kiya, bahut bata." So the Arogya Setu has been shown to be deeply problematic on a number of dimensions. As a thorough report prepared by the Internet Freedom Foundation put it, the app is a privacy minefield. It does not adhere to principles of minimization, strict purpose limitation, transparency, and accountability. The second interesting point is that the Arogya Setu was not developed entirely by government's National Informatics Center, as has been claimed so far. In response to an RTI query, you know why the RTI is being absolutely devastated by this government, because RTI has been a very powerful tool of information. So it's being completely devastated right now, it's practically dysfunctional. In response to an RTI query, the government was forced to concede that private partnership was involved in the developing of an app that we were all being forced to download. And who these partners are, we still don't know. Now, state surveillance is a project. It's not necessarily or exclusively a capitalist project. State surveillance, that's its job. State surveils you. But what is relevant here is the emergence of data capitalism. So I'm not going to focus so much on the privacy and surveillance angle, but on the data capitalism angle. Globally, from the mid-1990s onwards, it's a well-entrenched phenomenon. Sarah Myers West defines data capitalism as a system which enables an asymmetric redistribution of power that is weighted towards the actors who have access and the capability to make sense of information. So the whole point about data capitalism is that we are all now, the term is prosumers. We are producing and consuming. Every video we watch, every time we go to Facebook to look at the pictures of our friends, every time I Google something on my phone, I am producing data for data capitalism. I'm consuming and I'm producing. So really the only way to get out of data capitalism is to go off the grid. I don't know how that's possible. I feel as if the phone is a part of my body. Imagine it came into my life in the last 5 years, 10 years of my life. All of you have never known a life without a mobile phone. So I don't know what that means. But what I'm saying is, if we are to fight capitalism, we have to think way beyond defeating a particular government. We have to think way beyond defeating a particular government. We have to think about that. That's very crucial. But that is only the first step. So the relentless push by the Indian government towards downloading the app, and this whole business of how digitized India is, oh how great we are, everything is done online. Yes, we are producing data for data capitalism. That's what we are doing. The data generated can be used, shared, and stored in ways about which we know nothing and over which we have no control. Now, I need to point to the fact, so I've talked about general, as I said, general capitalism and the saffron agenda, but there is a particular way in which the capitalist policies of the Hindu Rashtra also maintain the anti-Muslim thrust of Hindutva ideology. They managed to do both. So partly we saw what they did in Kashmir, but we know that the RSS and the BJP have quite smoothly marginalized Muslim small businesses, Muslim fisher people, partly formally, partly, so formally you do it by various kinds of urban, clan-linked things, which is where you say, okay, you can't sell here, or you can't have Muslim traders near so many meters near a temple, etc. Right? Those are formal ways. But informally, we know that Hindutva organizations call for and enforce social boycott of Muslim businesses, which is actually very violent. So the BJP government in India since 2014 has accelerated the processes also of dispossessing indigenous people from their lands, restructuring the economy along a neoliberal worldview. Now, so what I've tried to say so far is, I'll take another 5 minutes. What I've tried to say so far is that capitalism is a bigger enemy, it's a larger fight. We have to think very differently about what our politics will be, what a left anti-capitalist politics will be. And in this room, I have to say that left parties have also not taken an anti-capitalist position at all. I won't say more, but I'm very open to questions, okay? I won't say more right now, but the fact is, I think we all know, I will say names of 3 places, Singur, Nandigram, Vilna. And we have to think about that. We are responsible for that. You are the younger generation, you are the face of those parties. We have to think about capitalism as something much bigger than party politics. Now, I want to now move to finally, in the last part of my presentation, to what will, I'm sure, sound completely, at best you'll say utopian, at worst you'll say she's utterly crazy, but I'm used to both, so that's fine. I have a thick skin. So I want to think about what are the ways. So I've already given you one sense of data capitalism and how do we get out of it and what does it mean. And I haven't taken any steps towards getting out of it. I'm just saying, I'm putting myself there as well. How do we talk about getting off the grid, right? Or how do we talk about defeating or fighting data capitalism? But I want us to think about now, when we think beyond the capitalist horizon, how do we have to think? What do we have to be critical about? And one of the things that one notices is that what is called renewable sources of energy, which is now really caught on, the idea of renewable sources, because after all, one of the biggest solar energy farms in India are by Adani. Adani is the one who's. So clearly there is such a thing as renewable energy for green capitalism. So this is what we have to now think about, that renewable energy cannot be brought about without a radical rethinking of the economy. So if we think about renewable energy without rethinking industrialization and capitalism altogether, we are still trapped. What happens is that it becomes regulation. The environment is to be regulated in the interests of long-term extraction. Within this perspective, even renewable sources of energy are envisaged as being the means to ensure endless production and consumption. The earth cannot tolerate endless production and consumption. Just take it from me. We're leaving behind an earth for you that cannot do that. Okay, I'm out. I'm like, tata, you deal with it. Now let me give you, for example, a characteristic statement illustrating this perspective. This is Barack Obama's inaugural address after his first election, in which he declared poetically, "We will harness the sun and the winds and the soil to fuel our cars and run our factories." That's what we're going to use renewable energy for, to fuel our cars and run our factories. They will keep sending their energies swallowing cars here to the global south, and they will make renewable energy cars, all of which are using up the renewable energy, right? So these words convey no sense of the fact that assumptions about consumption, urbanization, and endless growth have to be urgently and drastically rethought. Let me conclude with two instances of the ironies brought about by green capitalism, aided by the state. Across Central Europe, ancient forests are being cut down, ground to sawdust, and formed into pellets to be shipped across Western Europe. For what? To help the region's countries reach their renewable power commitments. This process is completely legal, encouraged by the green energy government's subsidies. Now, these pellets were initially meant to be made out of waste sawdust and wood chips. Because of the subsidies, wood pellets are now Europe's largest renewable energy source, far ahead of wind and solar. But as demand has soared and Russia's war against Ukraine has created an energy crunch, entire forests are being cut down to make pellets which are supposed to be energy renewed, and they're being subsidized for it. This is how capitalism works, folks. You think I'm crazy? Capitalism is crazy. You know, it's like Kalidas' story about sitting on the branch and sawing away. That's what capitalism does. Second, in a study of solar energy in India, a young scholar, Nivedita points out some disturbing features of the construction of massive solar energy parks in India. Now, these massive solar energy parks involve, first of all, land acquisition on a massive scale. But interestingly, and I didn't know this till I read this work, these require enormous amounts of the most precious commodity, water. Why do solar energy parks require water? So she refers to a particular solar energy project in Karnataka. That area has experienced extreme droughts, which is in fact a major factor in the decision to set up solar farms there. And in fact, that's the reason why 94% of solar farms are located in areas of drought, because you can't have agriculture, set up solar energy, there's sun. But the operation of solar technologies requires large quantities of water to clean the surface of panels. Did you ever think of this? The surface of panels have to be cleaned of dust, bird shit, and other kinds of particulate matter that serve to block sunlight and reduce the efficiency of energy production. This is a drought-prone area. There is no water. There is just not, so you're going to just take more and more water from the ground to clean the solar energy panels, which are renewable energy. So if at all we're going to think of renewable energy, we have to think of it in a very decentralized, localized way. It cannot be at the level of large capitalists making huge profits, because it's self-destructive, okay? We have to move out of the horizon set by capitalism altogether. Let us consider a philosophy called degrowth. You can look it up. It's a very interesting philosophy and movement. It's Europe-based. It comes out of Germany. Degrowth philosophy rejects GDP as an indicator of economic well-being, proposes a decentralized framework for transformation to a lower and sustainable level of consumption and production. It calls for a shrinking of the economic system to leave more space for human cooperation and ecosystems. So degrowth calls for downsizing production and consumption in a way that increases human well-being, enhances ecological conditions and equity on the planet, focuses on sufficiency, not efficiency, innovation, not just to take technology to higher levels, because what is high levels? iPhone generation this, generation that, and it's like there's a continuous, you realize there's a continuous obsolescence of the gadgets we have. I'm being mocked in my home by my own family because I have one Maruti Wagoner, and that 15 years are up and I will buy another Maruti Wagoner, and they're like, seriously, there are so many new kinds of cars. I'm my own brother and sister. I'm just saying. So it just becomes like a crazy thing to even say that I don't want to buy the next generation. But can you afford to not buy? No, because certain features become unavailable. Certain parts become unavailable. This is called planned obsolescence. This is planned obsolescence that forces you to keep buying and keep buying and keep buying. So innovation to build new social and technical arrangements, and degrowth calls for a future where societies live within their ecological means with open, localized economies and resources more equally distributed through new forms of democratic institutions. So that's degrowth, and you can, I just conclude here, but you can think of, for example, in South Africa, with Protestant University, there's an experiment which is really interesting. What are they doing in Johannesburg in that university? They are, of course, COVID kind of made it difficult, and so that project has to be restarted, because the thing about students is that then they just pass out, right? Now there's a new bunch of students there. But faculty and students made, so there's just flowers and trees, it's a very beautiful campus. All the flowering plots were transformed into vegetable plots. Fruit trees have been planted, that will take some time. But these vegetables, any hungry person can pick, and there's a community kitchen, you can cook. So there will be no hunger on this campus. And they don't have to be dependent on anyone. This is an interesting idea, right? There are interesting ways in which you can think of, imagine if all those beautiful traffic circles in Delhi, which any of you has been to Delhi at this time, it is blooming with beautiful flowers. I'm all for beautiful flowers, make half of them vegetables and let poor people pick it. There could be a system. These are you have to think outside the capitalist horizon, and that's not something any left party is doing today. And we need to push left parties towards a new kind of way of thinking about the economy. Degrowth is one suggestion. There will be multiple options. Heterogeneity is the key. Every area doesn't have to do the same thing, and we have to think locally, we have to work towards